Hi, I'm Gene Schriefer, ag educator with the University of Wisconsin-Madison, down here in the Driftless region, tucked away in the southwest corner of Wisconsin, not too far from Illinois and Iowa, a little bit further from Indiana. Today we're talking about weed pressure, weed management, as well as fertility in pasture settings. I'm not sure why I have this section. Most likely people have been to my farm and seen my weeds. This is an area where you might get a little different opinion than maybe what other people think or talk about. So for me, a weed is only a weed if nothing wants to eat it, or it's limiting my forage production. If we look at a lot of weeds that our livestock are readily grazing, even though there's plenty of other forage out there, they're exceptionally high quality. I've taken forage samples. I've looked at what's the value of dandelion. It's really good feed, and judging by livestock preferences for it, a lot of these weeds are highly palatable and highly nutritious. So I will grant that some weeds, if nothing's eating it, can be unsightly. We're often concerned about what the neighbors are going to think because there's weeds in a field. But when we think about it also in terms of how much weed pressure do we need before it's starting to limit forage production, we're looking at 25-30% of the total dry matter in a field before weed pressure is getting higher than the amount of forage that we're able to produce off it. That's a really large amount of weeds. If we use nature as our model in a natural system, everything on this planet that was ever alive gets eaten by something else at some point, even you and I, right? And as we look at pastures and weeds, there's diseases and pests that are going to impact them as well. But for something that wants to eat that weed or eat that pest, there has to be the food resource first. So if we're constantly killing that weed, we never have something that wants to eat that weed present in our pasture. When we have a vacuum, if we have a bare spot on a pasture, nature is going to fill it in. Nature abhors a vacuum. Anytime we have bare spots on our pasture, it's a lost opportunity to harvest sunlight and convert that into forage, which then our livestock can convert into meat, milk, and fiber. So even when we have weed pressure and a bare ground, that weed is still helping feed soil biology. So it's not a total loss. We are helping stimulate and feed soil biology, which is a good thing. But we need to think about, why do we have weeds there in the first place? The two things that come to mind most frequently are grazing management, and we'll dive into that a little bit more, and then also pasture fertility. Now, pasture fertility is a pretty straightforward thing. We can take soil tests. Here, a soil test is about $8.50 per sample. If you do that every 4 or 5 years, we're looking at investing 50 cents an acre per year for information to make better decisions on how we can better manage our forage and our pastures. We can learn whether or not there's any limiting factors that are going to impact forage production. Basic soil test is going to tell us about soil acidity. It'll give us a value for soil pH. It'll tell us organic matter. It'll tell us in percent or parts per million of phosphorus and potassium. Very key pieces of information. If our soil pH is too low, this may impact the types of species that are able to grow and persist and thrive in our soil environment. Might impact some soil biology. Lime, fortunately, is a pretty inexpensive amendment that lasts for a long time. And if we can adjust that to the proper pH, we can get better species diversity and better production from our pastures by having that information. So in addition to soil pH, if we're interested in making sure that we have a good composition or percentage of the sward in legumes, we also want to take a look at our potassium levels. Legumes are very dependent on soil levels of potassium, And if we have adequate levels in the soil, those legumes are going to persist for longer periods of time. They're going to survive winter better, and they're going to contribute to our gain or milk production on our pasture acres. Ruminants that we're grazing are remarkable animals. They are taking material that's indigestible, unusable to us, forages, grasses, legumes, and converting that into things that we can use: milk, meat, fiber. And as remarkable as they are, they're also really inefficient, because of all the forage that they take in the front end, 70, 80, 90% of those nutrients go right out the back end, redistributed back on our pasture, where the soil starts to recycle those nutrients to grow the next amount of grass. So nature recycles everything. Our job as managers is making sure that we've got good manure distribution as evenly as possible across that paddock system. As we lengthen out those occupancy periods, cattle or livestock tend to congregate in certain areas, favorite areas, perhaps around shade, perhaps around water, and we'll see concentrations of nutrients in those areas. Over time, if we allow that to occur, eventually we're going to have to replace a lot of those nutrients elsewhere on the pasture because we've moved it into those specific locations. As we shorten that occupancy period, as we increase the density of livestock on that area, we get more uniform distribution of manure and urine. Our pasture fertility remains fairly constant. We don't really export that much, only when livestock leave the farm or if we're a dairy, if we're exporting milk. Those are the nutrient flows that are leaving the system. In addition to purchasing fertility, commercial fertility, if we need N, P, and K, we also may have the opportunity to feed livestock in the winter. Now, here in Wisconsin, we enjoy our frozen tundra. Well, I don't know if we enjoy our frozen tundra, but we have a frozen tundra experience every winter. And the snow is too deep that we do have to feed. If we can feed on our pasture, all of that fertility in the manure and urine adds to that fertilizer bank in the soil. So we need to do some accounting for the amount of nutrients entering the system if we're going to be feeding on pasture in those non-grazing times of the year. Wanted to visit a little bit more about weed management on pasture. Certainly there are times where we legitimately have weeds that we need to think about controlling. And in most cases, or many cases, we see annual and biennial weeds. So the annual weeds complete their life cycle in a single year, germinate in the spring, reproduce, and are dead by fall. Biennials typically germinate in mid to late summer, over winter, and then they complete their life cycle the following spring and early summer before dying. What both of those two different types of weed species need in order to germinate is sunlight. And this gets at this idea of pasture management and the role of residual. In fact, when we've looked at the residual height and weed pressure, we see a linear relationship. The taller the residual, the lower the weed pressure goes over time. Now, that's not to say we're going to get to zero, but there will be a lot less weeds when we practice good grazing management that leaves residual intact, especially at those times of the year when those seeds are trying to germinate. So our goal is to create that thick, dense, vigorous stand of forage that can outcompete those weeds. From a grazing management, this is residual, but when we improve our density, the number of livestock on a weight per area basis. Maybe it's mob grazing. It depends on how you'd like to define that. But we want to graze that forage off. If we don't graze it off, we want to trample it. And if we've got that pressure there, what weeds we do have present are going to be stomped into the ground and not allowed to reseed, reproduce, and add to the seed bank. And it's all about the management.